So the ANC has lost its bid to have the uMkhonto weSizwe party deregistered and removed from the May 29 ballot paper. But the Electoral Court found the governing party's arguments to be irrational. The battle for the MK party is not over yet, though. Today, both parties are in KZN over their logo, branding and name. But how much does branding really matter in an election year? Particularly one as hotly contested as this one. To answer that question, we are joined by Managing Director of Reputation First, Tshepo Matseba. Tshepo, a good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. So we'll be watching closely as the ANC and MK party face off today over their logo and the name of this new party. But does it matter? So essentially what I'm asking you is, if the ANC were to succeed in this matter, does it make a difference for the MK party?
Good morning. Thank you for inviting us. Yes, the naming convention and the branding makes sense, and it matters especially in the context of a plethora and multitude of political parties, new political parties that will be on the ballot paper. So having a name and identity early on is helpful. And if you launch with a particular name and in the process find yourself having to change that name because perhaps let's assume if a court finds differently that actually this name belongs to the African National Congress, then this party would face a challenge because they would have limited time to promote themselves and to articulate the proposition in a different name. But at the same time, it might actually yield different results in the world of public relations, where the MK party, even though the name that they go to the ballot with may change, they might actually have a little bit more conversation and share of voice in the public, especially in social media, but also in the mainstream media, and that automatically gives them some type of leverage in promoting the party. But the brand and the brand identity does matter indeed. Yeah, but
I get the sense that even just this back and forth going to court is doing that already, right? Keeping them on the news rundowns. We continue talking about them. I mean, some will argue perhaps that they're utilizing this case as a strategic tool to disseminate their message.
Oh, yes, it's a very powerful positioning opportunity. And because it's news, in this specific instance, it's not a political party promotion in the context of ICASA regulations, where media houses would have to give political parties equitable coverage. This is news. And in this context, they are now occupying headlines across the country without actually paying for it and without having the limitations of those guidelines for as we run up towards elections. So therefore, there's a win either way for the MK party. But what matters the most now in terms of branding is whether the African National Congress has registered the words, the key words that will be contested as intellectual properties. Because in a business and an organization, for you to own and claim rights to use a specific word or association or colors or brand identity, you would have to register it as an intellectual property, as material, as a trademark that belongs to your organization. And if the words uMkhonto weSizwe and the words uMkhonto weSizwe are not registered as trademarks, it's going to be very difficult to argue for the deregistration of this name, for the MK not to use this name. And importantly, it's going to be tricky to say the word MKP belongs to the African National Congress because they can argue fairly about the assertion and association with uMkhonto weSizwe. But it's very, very difficult, I think, to argue about the abbreviation MKP. So it will be a fascinating journey. Having former President Jacob Zuma on their ballot paper gives them leverage because he's a known brand, he's a known face. He used to be the president of the country for a while. That and the president of the ANC, that in itself gives them some type of leverage, even if you change their name. But you actually want to run up towards an election with the same name, because acronyms can get tricky for voters.
Yeah, I think back to, I think it was 2016, and you may remember this. We saw a new kid on the block that was the AIC. And a big talking point at the time was, I think the party actually managed to make massive inroads. It surprised many when it tripled the number of seats it received in councils across the country. And I'm reading, of course, an article all the way back from 2016. And tripled its seats that it received across the country. And what you may remember about that was it was on the ballot papers, and its color scheme was a very clear yellow that looked very similar to the ANC's colors. So let's talk about, how this can actually perhaps work as a way of also confusing the electorate when they get to that ballot paper.
Oh, yes. So when you look at the colors on the logo, at least, of this MK party, those colors are not confusing. Where parties, where actually the voter might be confused is the regalia that they wear. So look at the T-shirts that they wear, the golf shirts, very similar to those of the ANC. And so there'll be a large degree of confusion. But also importantly, if you are a voter and you don't follow news deeply, perhaps you are an elderly person and you don't follow news extensively, you might see the face. Whoever comes first on the ballot paper might give you some confusion. You might actually confuse the fact that you are seeing the face of former President Jacob Zuma and think that you're actually taking the vote for the ANC. Because actually when you're in the ballot paper, even as some of us in the middle age, when you're in the ballot box, paging through that paper, you might actually, sometimes make a mistake. I know that at some point early on in my life, I made a mistake when I voted provincially, for example. So I thought I'm ticking the right box, but actually it was almost like a multiple choice question where you want to tick A and then you tick A and C.
Yeah.
and that becomes a tricky proposition.
Yeah.
But the winning formula perhaps in this specific instance is for all the parties to articulate their manifestos and their promises clearly and in a simple language so that the voter can recall the messages. But from a branding point of view, it will be difficult, a slightly difficult challenge for you to go to an election with a new name if that were to happen.
I'm starting to think perhaps Congress of the People may have missed an opportunity here. I mean, when they were registered as a breakaway party, there was, of course, that discussion around the Congress of the People being, I suppose, a former structure, a former sitting of the ANC during the struggle, and perhaps their color scheme, they missed that opportunity of really grabbing the branding and running all the way with it.
Yeah, I think COPE at the time attempted to be distinctive and unique, and they had the face of former President Thabo Mbeki moving around in their posters when they were campaigning, but they didn't articulate honestly that actually he was not part of the party, even though the party was formulated during the reaction to his removal from office. And so that created many challenges for them, but also within the ranks of COPE, they didn't have consistency in terms of leadership. They were not aligned consistently, and that created many problems for them as we see today. But from a branding point of view, their colors were actually powerful. If you look at the brand identity of COPE, they may have chosen to be distinctive, but that distinctiveness, if the messaging and the delivery on the ground was consistent, we would probably be delivering a different story. So parties, of course, that are formed out of a particular, perhaps, dissatisfaction are not necessarily, without having a political strategy, are not necessarily sustainable as a proposition. And we see that if you look at the distinction between parties like AHAM, for example, that didn't last so much, and parties like the Economic Freedom Fighters, where you have younger people at the time who actually understood the administration of gathering masses and gathering a following. So it will be interesting to see, because in the MK party you have people who actually understand political organization.
Right, let me ask you this, and I need to squeeze one last one in and I'm out of time, but if you can answer this as briefly as you possibly can. The ANC, that defeat yesterday in the Electoral Court, I mean, what does this do for brand ANC? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, the ANC has lost many cases in courts, different cases, and they've won different cases in courts. They've been around. If you look at their sustainability as a party, I think they will be around, and the likelihood of them being in charge still nationally is there. But will they have some dents and impact, especially in KwaZulu-Natal? Definitely. And is there a dent on their reputation and image? Yes, definitely. And they would need to articulate their proposition and remind voters about who they are, as opposed to focusing on a newly formulated party, or as opposed to focusing on the opposition. They should tell us what exactly they're going to do differently to fix the challenges that are facing this country. Yeah.
Tshepo Matseba there is, of course, Managing Director of Reputation. First answering the question, does the name, logo and branding of a political party really, really matter? Always a pleasure having him on the show.